Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I feel very privileged to have come after Gerhard and before Rick Pointer. I'd like to talk a little bit about the archive today and a specific project that we have been currently working on, is currently up at the college, at the Royal College of Art. I'd like to talk a little bit about the kind of context out of which this project emerged, but also kind of a broader scoping of the context of archives generally and the exhibition. The role of graphic design archive within the Academy is increasingly gaining visibility in defining what a history of the profession and its pedagogical framework might be. Whilst there are fewer trained graphic design historians than in other subcategories of the academic discipline of design history, the field excels in producing practitioner historians, graphic designers who have focused on writing about and curating the subject. This paper will also explore the role of the archive within the Academy, and specifically through an exhibition, a book, which has literally just come off press here, and a program of talks which wrap around the RCA's current exhibition, GraphicsRCA 50 Years. This exhibition sets out to celebrate, but also explore, what might be behind the RCA-ness of the RCA. In other words, what might we learn about pedagogical practices, individual student aspirations, and the nature of the art school through viewing past work from graduates produced whilst they were still students in graphic design at the Royal College of Art. GraphicsRCA 50 Years takes as its starting point the first exhibition of graphic design at the RCA, which was staged in 1963, 15 years after the founding of the School of Graphic Design in 1948. This exhibition included work by then students who are now recognized as some of Britain's top designers, including David Gentleman, the designer and illustrator of books, covers, and postage stamps, Alan Fletcher, one of the partners at Pentagram and author of The Art of Looking Sideways, the crime writer Len Dayton, whose book The Ipcris Files became a blockbuster film, and Ridley Scott, whose student film A Boy and Bicycle was one of the features of the exhibition. And as we know, he has produced a number of films, including my favorite, Blade Runner. And the list goes on in terms of the graduates from 1963 and before. And it certainly provided a roll call of Britain's emerging pioneers. The recent exhibition, GraphicsRCA 50 Years, also has a roll call of star designers. John Pash, who designed the Rolling Stones' Lips identity. Jonathan Barnbrook, whose provocative typefaces and political acumen continues to resonate. Maria Willer, a partner in Pentagram, as well as graduates who have founded collaborative studios, including Carter Wong, Julia, A Practice for Everyday Life, Thomas Matthews, and Kurt Noble. Least we also not forget the role of the RCA's tutors, all notable within their field. Margaret Calvert, Dan Fern, Gert Dunbar, and Neville Brody, just to name a few. Each member of staff has brought a very particular take on graphic design, which has proven to be influential both inside and outside the institution. Yet, saying this, my paper is less about the stars of the graphic design world and the canon that creates, although important to signal, but more about exploring a collective consciousness which has been nurtured. And for us here today, a number of questions arise. What role does the archive play within the Academy, and how might this contribute to an understanding of institutional and pedagogical history? And how might exhibitions like GraphicsRCA inform a broader understanding of graphic design history? But before I embark on a discussion about this particular exhibition, I would like to explore the context out of which this set of questions has emerged. In 1983, I participated as a young graduate student in Coming of Age, the first symposium on the history of graphic design, held at the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. Organized by Professors Barbara Hodick and Roger Remington, the two-day event was intended to bring together the seemingly disparate parts of art, printing, typography, photography, and advertising. It did this through the program of talks by notable designers, Massimo Vanelli and Francis Butler, educators such as Sheila Levrant de Bretteville and Lorraine Wild, and historians Victor Morglan and Phil Meigs. They had all reached a point in their practices where questions were asked as to what a forward-thinking approach about graphic design education and the profession might be. As part of this coming of age, delegates to the symposium acknowledged that any history of graphic design formed a crucial component of future discussions on the profession and education. Bill Bonnell, at the time a director for the American Institute of Graphic Arts, summarized in the symposium's proceedings, "The conference itself may become a small niche in graphic design history, but most of the conferees had the impression that they were at least present for a step forward for the graphic design profession." Equally, and as a result of this symposium, delegates clearly proposed a framework for moving forward by taking into account the difference between what designers can do in graphic design history and what art historians can do. At the time, graphic design histories were written by art historians whose understanding of design and the visual relied on a more conventional historical and methodological position to emerge out of the work of culturally significant individuals, style, movements, and periods. The establishment of design history, and indeed graphic design history, as an academic study has a set of transatlantic connections, but for the moment fall outside the scope of this paper. However, it is important to note that similarly, a decade earlier in the UK, the positioning of design history within a context of art history had also taken place. Design history was predictably presented as an art history of design. Jonathan Woodham at the University of Brighton explains, in the early to mid-1970s, excuse me, those setting out to legitimize the history of design as a significant field of academic study considered it important to differentiate clearly their new discipline area from what was still then prevalent traditional art historical emphasis on artist style, period, iconography, and connoisseurship. The emergence of Britain's polytechnics in the 1970s, a restructuring of the art and design education and technological subjects in higher education, became distinct from the university system, provided a new forum for developing the idea of a new academic field. Design history now had the opportunity to move away from a more conventional art historical positioning to one that embraced an analysis of objects of the everyday, popular and material culture. And at the same time, polytechnics such as Middlesex Polytechnic in the mid-1970s began to see a shift where designers were retraining in this new field and taking on the critical engagement with their own histories as practitioners. This is the context in which my own work is positioned, having trained as a graphic designer and completing my MA in the history of design at Middlesex Polytechnic, and then going on to do a PhD in the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication at the University of Reading. I have argued in a previous paper, Whose History, Graphic Design and Context, that graphic design history might be viewed specifically through the writings of its history. The examples I have focused on were books published by the history of graphic designers, including those by Phil Meigs, A History of Graphic Design, Patrick Ramsey, The Story of Graphic Design, and Stephen Eccleston, A New History, as well as Joanna Drucker and Emily McVarish, Graphic Design History, A Critical Guide. And I add to that two more recent examples defining a history of graphic design produced by occasional papers through the writings of British practitioner historian Richard Hollis in Writings About Graphic Design, and a historiographical approach in collecting writings on the history of the subject in Sarah DeBont and Catherine de Smet's Graphic Design, History and Writing, 1983 to 2011. We can identify the indicators of a turn in graphic design history in shifting from a linear chronological history offered by Meigs in his version in 1983 to that which positions graphic design within a critical history based in shaping a history of ideas and assumptions about forms of communication, as found in Drucker and McVarish in 2009. Although Drucker and McVarish, like Meigs, take as their starting point a prehistoric prelude to graphic design, theirs is a theoretical framing which maps more clearly cultural conditions and attitudes to the graphic object. A similar term may also be understood to have taken place in relationship to examining the development of curation as exhibitions about graphic design became more commonplace. Joanna Drucker problematized this issue clearly in her review of the 1990s exhibition, Graphic Design in the Mechanical Age, which was curated by Ellen Lupton and others at the Cooper Hewitt in New York. In her review, Drucker draws the conclusion that graphic design history has an important methodological role to play at this moment and should be wary of falling into a celebrity author-artist model of stylistic innovation and history of forms or movements. She goes on to say that it's easier to trace a lineage of forms than it is to research the conditions that sustain their production. And this is really true for fine art, where such questions challenge the fundamental autonomy granted to modern art as it is for design. Graphic Design in America, a Visual Language History at the Walker Art Center was curated by Mildred Friedman at the Walker Art Center in 1989, was the first large-scale museum exhibition to prompt consideration of graphic design as a serious subject for historical study, taking into account design's role as a force for social, political, and technological change. The curator explained, "We want to present graphic design in terms of its social functions, as well as its purely aesthetic qualities. This is a challenging job because a large segment of the public is unaware of graphic design as a major discipline, and many designers are unprepared to look at their work in broad terms." Friedman's survey of American graphic design made visible to a broader public the role and importance of graphic objects in our lives: newspapers, logos, advertising, packaging, and so forth. For those of us pursuing our studies at the time, the exhibition presented a rich resource of visual materials, whilst also prompting questions around the formation of narratives of graphic design history. By placing an emphasis on "a" rather than "the" in the title, for example, Friedman unwittingly prompted debate around the positioning of history, by whom and for whom, but also whether this was intended to be a singular or definitive historical account of the subject. Over 2 decades later, graphic design, now in production, returned to the idea of the broad historical survey for graphic design with a curatorial team led by Andrew Blauvelt and Ellen Lupton, with many others involved. The Walker Art Center's press release describes the work as representing the most vital sectors of communication design, as evidenced through the work on display, ranging from design-driven magazines, newspapers, books, and posters, as well as branding programs for corporations, subcultures, and nations. Whilst Friedman's original exhibition and accompanying catalog focused on American graphic designers as well as immigrant designers, now in production took a more global perspective on graphic design. And as David Cabianca highlights in his review published on Design Observer, the exhibition also showcases a series of developments over the past decade, such as the entrepreneurial nature of designer-produced goods, the renaissance in digital typeface design, the storytelling potential of titling sequences for film and television, and the transformation of raw data into compelling information narratives. This is perhaps closer to what Drucker had envisaged for contemporary graphic design, to move beyond a history of stylistic forms and celebrities toward researching the conditions that sustained their production. Furthermore, Cabianca observed the equal weight given over to text and visual work in the accompanying catalog, and perhaps the way that signaled the way in which curators are readdressing the balance between theory and practice. And in doing so, indicates an acceptance of a history found within both written and visual forms. Over the last decade, we have seen an increased appetite from the graphic design community as well as a broader public for exhibitions on the subject. The challenge for curators has been to look to new approaches for ways of showing and telling about the work on display. The role of the thematic exhibition, for example, also plays a role in shaping another alternative history of graphic design, and one which is perhaps more closely aligned to curatorial art practice. Rick Pointer's curating of uncanny surrealism in graphic design in Brno, and his earlier critically acclaimed Communicate Independent British Graphic Design since the 1960s, centers the work around specific themes in order to explore in some depth the relationship of the selected works and history of ideas, but also in time and across historical periods. The result here, as Pointer stated at the time of the Barbican exhibition, which was the Communicate one, is how graphic design is now firmly situated within a broader public discourse on contemporary popular culture. He writes, "We have invested so much in the idea of art's central place in visual culture that it is difficult to accept that while the art world's store-minders were looking the other way, design may simply have slipped around the back." More recently, we find a similar approach, although pointing forward to John Sueda's All Possible Futures, which took place in San Francisco this year. The exhibition featured 37 speculative projects exploring the potential of graphic design already residing at the intersection of design and fine art. Here, the curator chose to focus on the self-initiated project or investigative practice as a way of expanding the call for the validity of a more experimental approach to mainstream practice. Sueda explains that such a work was at the core of an unrealized archive. Such an archive points toward the value of collecting speculative works. He explains, "They are really interesting inquiries that were perhaps too radical for the time they were proposed, or maybe the technology to execute them didn't exist. Some are just good ideas that got rejected for some strange reason. To me, the value of including these in the exhibition is allowing them to enter the larger discourse of graphic design and propel our discipline forward." But how does this come back to giving form to graphic design history? We may define the role of the graphic design historian as someone who is meant to locate events in time and to provide an explanation as to why events happened when they did. Historians establish links between the present and the past and contribute to an understanding of design as it is currently practiced. As the American graphic design historian Victor Margolin wrote in his contribution to Coming of Age in 1983, "There is no chronicle without documentation." Where the historian Keith Jenkins and the postmodernist historians have taken this idea further is to suggest that interpretation is key, and that a fact is not a fact until it is interpreted as a fact. Jenkins also argues in his classic book, Rethinking History, that history is a field of force. In other words, it is possible to consider the discourse of history as a series of ways of organizing the past by and for interested parties, but always with considered intent. This is interesting parallels with the inherent process involved with graphic design, and specifically the curatorial and editorial process through which the past is organized and displayed, such as exhibitions and their accompanying catalogs. The history of graphic design is more than a history of graphic objects. It's also a history of narratives formulated around process, production, social interaction, and discourse. So what does the archive bring to this process, to locate events in time? We usually understand archives as being either online or physical spaces where an accumulation of historical records is contained. Materials are selected on the basis of their enduring cultural, historical, or evidentiary value. There are different definitions of the archive. The Society of American Archivists defines the archive as serving the institutional memory of the college or university and plays an integral role in the management of the institution's information resources in all media and formats. I'd like to propose the importance of the archive that is situated within an art school deserves some consideration in the shaping and forming of a graphic design history. That is, an archive which perhaps is less about a systematic process of collecting, and instead a record which captures a slice of art school life, the work of its students and professors, the selection of books and ephemera, which helps to reveal and understand a pedagogical history of learning. In the preface to Walter Benjamin's Archives, its editor remarks, "Benjamin's archives consist of images, text, signs, things that one can see and touch, but they are also a reservoir of experiences, ideas, and hopes, all of which have been inventoried and analyzed by their stocktaker. The role of the archivist or collector is one of mediating and thus shaping knowledge, the knowledge available in the archives. This role is mirrored in that of the individual user of the archive, and in our case, the historian." Ellen Swain, writing in The American Archivist, has said, Postmodernists have placed archival practice under the microscope and concluded that both the individuals who use the archives and those who provide access to its holdings construct and author the meanings and truths of documents. Whether or not these arguments are valid, they offer a new lens through which to consider the archivist's role as collector or as creator. I want to come back again to 1983, a year in which graphic design history began to emerge as a field in its own right. That year, Roger Remington had begun collecting works by modernist design pioneers for the National Graphic Design Archive, housed at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and it was one of the prompts for hosting the Coming of Age Symposium. During the 1980s, with a growing awareness of graphic design history, the need to preserve and document the work of graphic designers began to drive the development of archive projects. In Remington's piece, A Case Study in Collaboration, looking back at the National Graphic Design Archive, written for Visible Language in 2004, Remington explores that a network of leading institutions were committed to the importance of preserving historical exemplars of the history of graphic design and the potential for sharing their experience and knowledge with others. And that original network included a number of special collections, such as those housed in the Container Corporation of America, which is a cardboard box manufacturer, the Professional Archive of the 1960s original Madman designer Hubu Lowen was at the Cooper Union, and at RIT, the designer Lester Beale's work formed the basis of the library's Cary Graphic Design Archive. RIT now, as an archive, hosts or boasts housing the original collections of more than 35 modernist American and Canadian graphic designers. The collection is also available as an online archive, thereby making graphic design and its history more widely acceptable. The premise for an archive in graphic design is summed up by Remington, who observes, "It is my firm conviction that for a student studying any discipline, knowledge of one's field is an essential requirement of being an educated professional. Without the knowledge of this unique time in American graphic design, it is impossible to understand fully what happened in the past and to have a context for what is occurring in the present and future with any sense of confidence." In 2012, the university opened the new Vanelli Center for Design Studies, evidencing further the institutional commitment to housing the works of pioneer designers. So how does the Graphic Design Archive help us to consider the ways in which we understand the history and for whom it is intended? I'd like to return to explore in more detail about the role of an archive in the academy, and specifically, the kind of role that an archive plays in shaping a history of graphic design. As we have seen, the impact of larger museum shows have helped to inform how we might understand the documentation and interpretation of graphic design history. The role of an exhibition based upon an institutional archive also provides an alternative perspective on the formation of a graphic design history. For students studying any discipline, knowledge of that discipline's history informs how students engage with the future of that discipline. Early this month, the exhibition, GraphicsRCA 50 Years, opened to celebrate half a century of creative excellence through the student work of our alumni. What the show allowed us to indulge in was reflecting and exploring on what the ethos was at the core of our school philosophy. In other words, where have we come from and where are we headed? The first exhibition of graphic design at the RCA had taken place in 1963, as I mentioned before, and featured the first 15 years of works by students from the School of Graphic Design. Richard Guyot, who had been appointed in 1948 as the first professor of graphic design at the RCA, introduced a vision of the art school as fostering a lifelong journey of self-discovery. This is also describing the evolution that graphic design itself has undergone in the last 50 years, both as a profession and as a taught discipline. Prior to 1948, the curriculum reflected a preoccupation with advertising studies, commercial design, and publicity. But by 1963, the transition was deemed complete, with a School of Graphic Design that formed an umbrella for its three main departments: design, illustration, and film and television. It was with the first exhibition of graphic design at the college that Guyot's vision was truly consolidated. He had brought with him an ethos for the school that was based on the philosophy of the Russian philosopher P.D. Ouspensky, who spoke of the emotional drive generated by an idea needing practical skill as well as intellectual analysis to test its feasibility. In the exhibition, student work clearly evidenced Guyot's belief that all the courses are based on skill and craftsmanship and have as their major aim the development of each student's individual talent. It is here that we began to understand Guyot's passion for the concept of head, hand, heart as forming the basis for a holistic designer. He believed that reflection, head, skill, hand, were central to the practice of the creative arts, but he also advocated the value of the emotion, the heart. Robert Storr, the artist and critic and Dean of School of Fine Arts at Yale University, highlights the early stage of the exhibition process, observing selection is the initial and in many ways the touchiest stage of this negotiation, since it inevitably means stating preferences. This was an example of our team. Although the responsibility for the final works resided with 4 curators, myself, Adrienne Shaughnessy, Jeff Willis, and Richard Doust, we had 2 curatorial associates, A.B. Vickers, a recent graduate in visual communication, and Natasha Trautman, currently a student in information experience design at the RCA. We also had an alumni advisor, Michele Giannuzzi. In addition, we had an amazing team of current student volunteers, too many to list here, who came from the RCA and their courses in the history of design, critical writing and art and design, and visual communication. They played a significant role in both the curation and exhibition processes. Our design identity team included 2 students who were also recent graduates, and we worked closely with alumni and past staff to help us respond to one of our first questions posed about the exhibition. What is the RCA-ness of the RCA? The criteria by which we selected work began in drawing up a short list of potential works. The list was based upon personal preferences, aesthetic concerns. A good portion of the student work was unknown to myself and Adrienne Shaughnessy as newcomers to the RCA. The archive was not labeled in any systematic way, but relied on the historical knowledge of alumni and tutors who had been both students and contributed to the first shows in 1963. Recognizing that our collective memory was not necessarily the best way forward for setting out a viable framework of themes, we asked for volunteers of current students to contribute to what they might know and be able to ascertain by way of thematic descriptors in the archive. One of the few weeks we spent collectively discussing what we saw in the collection, and with Richard Doust, who's seen on the right here, and Mick Perry on the left, and Mick was one of the technicians who had been at the college for many, many years. Their knowledge that they had actually began to help us pull together with the students a set of themes or categories for organizing, at least initially, the 6-plan chest full of work. And here I want to say we also relied heavily on the historical memories of our alumni who part of this project was about bringing the alumni back into the fold and being more engaged within the school. The overall categories that the students came up with included the college's social life, self-initiated work, craft letterpress technologies, and the college's client. And these formed a very broad overview of the way we were considering the exhibition to be designed. Now, exhibitions reinforce canons of history, but equally they can tell the story about less profile designers whose contribution to a profession is invaluable. And in order to do that, the exhibition itself was divided up into 2 phases. The first one being a set of timelines, 2 timelines, one which included all the students and staff listed in graphic design since 1963. And that's been an interesting process of alumni coming back, looking at the wall, that being the first thing that they come to, and telling us whether or not their names have been misspelled, so a big typographic challenge. The second wall that you see here with more of the images on it was a timeline which included students and staff in graphic design, but developed by the students that were working on the project, looking at key historical, social, and political events, which provided a context for the work undertaken at the RCA, but also included, by their insistence, quotes from alumni about their experiences over time at the RCA. The second part of the exhibition was much more physical in terms of its collection of works, but it also had a digital component. The works that you see here are from the archive and from selected alumni collections. This also brought into question the number of donations we've now received to enhance the archive itself from our alumni members. The design of the original display system that you see here, the tables and the hangers, were co-designed with students and with the London-based architectural firm Studio Octopi, and are based on some of the students thinking about being in the letterpress studios and seeing the drawing racks of which their works were hung. At the end of the gallery is an installation by Koye Shim. He's a PhD candidate in the RCA who programmed an algorithm to pull data from an online alumni database set up for the show, where graduates upload examples of students' work. This is a live stream of a digital archive. And it was important for us that we had the combination of a physical archive with a more dynamic living archive, and it was an important aspect of the show to explore. I just want to go through quite briefly some of the images from the collection, just to give you a little bit of a feel of that experience. I have to say to date that in the first 10 days of the exhibition, we've had over 4,000 visitors to the gallery. And many of those have been student groups coming from various universities who've been students who've been studying graphic design. And I think that idea that this exhibition, whilst originating at the RCA and being of RCA work, has a much wider impact and is disseminating some of those ideas to a broader audience. And I think for us, that was a really happy byproduct of the exhibition. Work by Ray Gregory, poster, dealing with the RCA Football Club benefit dance. Lots of social life at the RCA. From the Film Society, where students were often designing the posters which announced the various screenings that took place over time. I think Rick Pointer has written about this very eloquently, and I. Self-initiated work ranging that from Fuel, for example, and that of Daniel Eacock. Work having to do with craft, letterpress, and lo-fi technologies. Henrik Kubel, for example. Other letterpress from various workshops having to do with the notion of craft, and a detail of one of those books produced by one of the typography workshops. The collaborative aspect of publications like ARC magazine, ARC, which originated out of ARC magazine, ARK, where students from across the college come together to look at various subjects. So they're involved in the design, production, writing, and critical examinations that appear within those pages. Another one of the walls of posters. And then a detail of that having to deal with the client, Malcolm Goldie's phone card from the 1990s. So the GraphicsRCA archive, what does it all mean? What have we learned? Well, we're midway through the exhibition, so we're still kind of reeling from the initial setup process and everything else that's gone on around it, like the series of talks. But on just kind of immediate reflection, I think in terms of what we have learned by doing this, a process as a whole team of, as I said, alumni, current students, and staff, is looking at the pedagogical approach to facilitate students' learning and participation in exploring graphic design history. So students actually engaging with the archive, knowing that they had an end result to work toward, actually helped them look more deeply into their own thinking about graphic design, but also the kind of history that they were involved with at being at the college. The exhibition, the whole process, which took place over 18 months, brought graduates back into the college to share their experiences and to provide a sense of passing on knowledge to the current students. We started off last autumn with a symposium, a one-day symposium called Mapping Futures, Graphic Design Education in the Profession. And that allowed 150 educators to come in from outside of the college to help us better understand what we do at the RCA and who we might be. And alumni played a huge part in telling those stories. They've also been involved in a series of panel discussions to help us look a little bit more deeply in terms of our understanding of our RCA graduates. And we had our first event a couple of weeks ago looking at the state of graphic design education. We did one Tuesday evening looking at startups and the entrepreneurial graphic designer. And next weekend, Adrienne Shaughnessy is looking at defining graphic design and whom is it for. We also learned, in terms of the student and staff's involvement, that the archive itself took on a methodological role, which put education at the heart of the exhibition. It also provided a collective voice for students, staff, and alumni who came together as a team, who debated, explored, and produced a shared understanding of a historical notion of what the RCA might be. But what of the archive of the future? And I just want to show you a quick film here of the video wall that Koya Shim did as part of the digital installation, which actually provided the alumni an opportunity to upload work to a special site, which they could then curate themselves and then provide commentary on that as well. And this is the film, so just play it. So all these works are being pulled off of a database. So for us, it was very much about that live aspect. And during the private view, alumni had access to Wi-Fi and to the website, and were uploading images of work as we were all standing there. So again, very much the archive being a living archive. So in summary, I would just like to say that GraphicsRCA 50 years overall has been an extraordinary experience in that it provides a rich source of material from the college and school-based archives through which we have been able to explore with current students, staff, and alumni as to what graphic design may have been at the RCA, but equally to speculate about its future possibilities. It has been a unique privilege to be able to be immersed in an extraordinary archive of student work beginning in 1948 to the present, with the goal of better understanding the historical journey of a group of students over time, but also how their work has impacted or been influenced by the broader social, political, and production context. This is one archive, one installation, and hopefully a contribution to graphic design history. Thank you.